Ahdaf Soueif unites two cultures that we are often encouraged to find mutually exclusive, Islam and the West. Her novels brilliantly illuminate both sides of the cultural divide in which she lives and creates. Shouldn't she be afraid of being caught in the middle?
Ahdaf, it seems to me that in your work there are two big battles being fought. One is on behalf of the whole Islamic world against the uncomprehending West, and the other is your battle within the Islamic world. I think it's very important to talk about the first battle before we talk about the second, because otherwise it would put you in a false position. You might be seen to be criticizing Islam when what you're really doing in the first instance is saying this is a whole world that is not enough is known about it, it's been colonized for too long, and we're breaking free. Is that one of the things your books are doing?
Well, that seems to be one of the effects that they're having. I don't sort of I've never set out with an agenda to sort of tell people about the Muslim world or the Arab world, but the area that I'm interested in writing about, the sort of world that appeals to me, is that world, is my world, the Arab world, and also is the intersection, the sort of crossroads between that and the West. And so I guess in the course of writing, in the course of making up a story or depicting character, then you know I necessarily find myself representing the Arab world or the Muslim world. And since I aim to do it right, as it were, then I guess there does sort of enter this element of telling, and since I write in English, obviously, then this element does come in of telling people what it's really like, I suppose.
Well, you're at the crossroads, but the crossroads have shifted, haven't they? Because your books really start back at the turn of what is now the 20th century, the last century, when Egypt was a colonized country, occupied country. And the crossroads were there. British Empire was sitting right on top of an emergent Egypt, and it wasn't emerging. And that's really the long story that you're telling politically, is it not?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think with my latest book, The Map of Love, what I ended up looking at in telling two stories, one sort of contemporary, end of the 20th century, and one at the beginning, was I was trying to draw lines between where we are now, or where we were at the end of the 20th century, and where we were at the beginning, and what brought us there. So yes, even though, as you say, the crossroads had shifted, yet there is a relationship between them.
I think A Map of Love is a sensational book in every way. It's like The Sheikh with brains, really.
That is so interesting that you should say so, because certainly one of the impulses to begin with at the beginning of the book was that I wanted to write a kind of a sheikh, a desert romance, a big romantic story, but I also wanted it to be true, and I wanted the characters to be real, so that it wasn't the case that when they took off their Arab dress they actually were Westerners underneath. I wanted them to be through and through Egyptians.
Well, he's a fascinating character. He's
Sharif.
Sharif,
yes.
Yeah. He has been played on screen by Sean Connery in The Wind and the Lion. He was the smart sheikh. But what you've given him, of course, is tremendous mental depth. He is the man who should have been running his country, that's part of the story. All this talent was suppressed artificially by the British presence, which was necessarily uncomprehending. One might think, in the terms you're talking about, unnecessarily stupid, but definitely unnecessarily uncomprehending.
Yes, well, I mean, I think one of the characters in the book said that Lord Cromer, who was the British agent or ambassador in Egypt at the time, and the effective ruler, was a good patriot, a good British patriot. He was doing what was best for his country, but of course he wasn't doing what was best for Egypt, even though he, I think, maybe actually really believed that he was.
To what extent is Sharif Pasha made up? Were there men like him?
I think there were men like him. The research that I did at the time involved reading a lot of histories of the time and diaries of the time by both Egyptians and English people, and they were clearly men of caliber and of imagination and of integrity, who, you know, rather than sort of fulfill what they wanted to do, which is spend their life sort of making their country develop, in fact spent it in an inch-by-inch struggle against the British.
And this constant sense of wasted time as the developed world races past you.
Absolutely, absolutely.
It's the most arrogant thing an interviewer can do, is to tell a writer what she's really done. But let me tell you what you've really done in that book, is you've turned things upside down in the extent that the character who doesn't fit, the character who crosses cultures, and in your other book, the character who crosses cultures is really a woman like you from the Arab world, the Cairene world. Now, in A Map of Love, it's the English woman. She's the one. That's why it's like the Sheikh, because in the Sheikh she gets kidnapped by the Sheikh and carried away on his horse into the desert. Now, in the book, she is actually translated by love into this other world. And to make it work, you've got to make the love very powerful, and you do. Let me tell you something else you've done. It's a very, very believable love story. But was there anyone like her?
Yes, not in the details. I mean, nobody that I know of who sort of crossed in that way. Well, there is one woman, actually, Lady Digby, I forget her first name, Amelia, I think, who married a Syrian sheikh, and she was very much a woman of the world. She'd sort of been all over Europe. I think he was her 5th marriage, in fact, but it was the one that lasted longest, and she lived with him in Syria and Jordan, which wasn't Jordan at the time.
Ostracized by her own people?
She was very much ostracized by her own people, apart from the travellers, people like Richard Burton and his wife who visited her, the people who went out there.
That's the other Richard Burton, the famous scholar, not the later act.
Yes, absolutely.
Richard Burton, the Richard Burton we're talking about, was actually one of those Englishmen who did penetrate Arab culture very deeply. Did he not? I think one of the things you're saying in the book is that was a kind of dilettantism that really didn't affect anything.
Nothing at all, really, unless it sort of made some people out in the West see the Arab world differently. It also popularized, I guess, things like the 1001 Nights. And also, I think one of the things that he did, which was really interesting, the fact that he translated what was regarded as pornography, but were sort of classical Arabic erotic manuals, was very interesting and was quite important in kind of representing a different face of the Arab world and the Muslim culture. But to go back to your question, I think the woman who was most present in my mind when I started drawing Lady Anna Winterbourne was Lucy Duff Gordon, because her letters show this journey where she goes to Egypt in the middle of the 19th century for her health, and she gets a boat and she travels up the Nile to Luxor, and eventually when she dies, she actually dies in Luxor, in the house that she had lived in for years, and you see her through her letters, bit by bit, shedding all the preconceptions, all the prejudices, and really sort of getting to know the country and the people. And she also sort of sheds her European clothes, which of course are very unsuitable, and eventually ends up dressed as an Egyptian and living in Luxor.
The books make the Arab world rich, complex, very, very much worth defending, but defense is one of the big themes because the Arab world is under constant attack from, the only word for it is imperialism, right from the turn of the beginning of the 20th century. And this entails, in your book, telling your story of what you think of Jewish settlement in Palestine, which eventually led to Israel. Now, it puts you on the spot, in a way, because one way or another, the Western humanist tradition, on the whole, has done a very good job of understanding Israel, and not very good job at all of understanding the Palestinian point of view. Is that one of the things you're out to do, but to balance things up?
Yes, it is. I mean, I think that the Palestinian story is one of the greatest injustices that the world has known in the 20th century. And as you say, the sort of story from the Israeli side is so well known and so and attended to so sympathetically in the West that it has more or less obliterated the other side, the Palestinian story. And I mean, the fact that this is something that continues and that there are people who live terrible lives today, even as we speak, because of that, is, I think it's a terrible thing, and also because it seems to me that that at this point the situation is retrievable. In other words, Israel exists, and nobody in their right mind is now talking about the destruction of Israel. Therefore, it's there, and all the reasons for the West to be sympathetic to it and to its existence need not be...
But it's actually only quite recent that people have stopped talking about the destruction of Israel. Until quite recently, for example, Yasser Arafat actually believed that the state of Israel should be destroyed. And a lot of other people did too. It's a fairly recent political development.
It's a recent political development, but I think it's completely understandable. I mean, I think... don't get me wrong. I mean, I personally don't believe that the existence of the state of Israel is a good thing. I don't.
Well, I was going to get to that because I think your books say so.
No.
But one of the things you do by tracing it back and showing how it started is you're actually making a case for saying, I think it would be better if we could wind history back beyond the Balfour Declaration and start again.
Yes.
Yeah, but you can't do that.
No, I mean,
But it would be physically
pragmatically,
better.
you can't do that. And there are people who've been born and bred there, and, you know, so you have, in fact, another moral problem there if you start sort of trying to dislodge that. But the fact is that it was an unjust, a terribly unjust thing to have happened. And that but it is something that can still be, you can still make the best of the situation, if you like, by imposing some kind of sort of semi-just solution now. And that's why it seems worthwhile to go on about it, because it's not something that is entirely and utterly lost. I mean, we're not talking about the Native Americans now, for example, where there's nothing anyone can do about it. There is still something that can be done about the Palestinians, and I think it's very, very much in the West's hands, which is why it's worth writing about it to the West.
Isn't it in the hands of the Arab nations too? I mean, actually, it's so difficult to talk about all of the past and recent developments and to show how they're connected. But it was only the year before last that a deal was put to the Palestinians through Yasser Arafat, which pretty well gave Palestine a parallel state. There was still an argument over Temple Mount and holdings in Jerusalem and so on. And there were plenty of people, even within Israel, who were disgusted with the whole idea of ultra-Zionism and thought this was the way out, and were terribly disappointed when the Palestinians didn't take the deal.
I mean, I'm not terribly good on sort of dates and details unless I've actually sort of researched them. But at the end of '99, basically just after the Intifada started, there was a meeting at Camp David, which didn't work out. And then after that, there was a meeting at Taba, where the offers on the table were actually, I mean, they were terribly close to a deal. And the reason that didn't work out was because Barak was already on the way out. Everybody knew that he was, going to lose the election, and that he couldn't deliver whatever he signed.
It's one of the continuing tragedies of the situation that everything depends on the leaders at the time, and you rarely get the right man on both sides at once. Yeah. Now, I don't think you think as much of Sadat as I do, but Sadat was ready to make a deal on Israel. But by a terrible fluke of history, the man in the driving seat in Israel was Begin, the worst possible person. Now, when I read your book, you don't really go much for Sadat. Is one of the reasons you don't like him that he was going to give way on Israel?
No, not specifically that. I mean, I think that he could have played a more clever game, and there's, there's no doubt that sort of in theory everybody wants peace. But given that Egypt is the biggest sort of country in the area, and that peace with Egypt was a very important thing for the Israelis to get. I think it could have been hitched more closely to some really solid deal for the Palestinians as well. But Sadat, it was really his internal policies that I find, and a lot of Egyptians find, distasteful. I mean, the fact is that he was responsible, really, for creating the Islamist extremists from whom we're suffering until today. And that was a very deliberate policy on his part. And it was based on the fact that he by nature was not a socialist. I mean, he really wanted to push Egypt closer to the West. He believed in the capitalist ideals of the United States, and he liked the image of himself as a friend of Henry Kissinger and a friend of the West. And
so
he
how
sort
does
of really
extremism come out of that? As
got off on that. Well, what he did was he needed to get close to the States. He needed to change the economy of the country from a socialist economy to a capitalist economy, to have an open-door economy which sort of encouraged capitalist investment from the West and so on. And he knew that there was a lot of opposition to this within the country, and the opposition mainly came from the leftist groups. These are moderately leftist, I mean, people who would be kind of like Labour, not New Labour, but Labour here, and Liberal Democrats and so on. And from the Nasserist camps, who also tended to be socialist. So in order to...
that means followers and admirers of Nasser.
Of Nasser.
You actually do admire Nasser.
I admire Nasser for his foreign... I admire Nasser for a lot of things. I'm not as sort of rosy about him as I used to be, but I do admire him for a lot of things.
It does creep into your books that terrible things happened under his regime too, but on the whole, you admired his pride in Egypt and the way he thought he could take it forward along...
Indeed, yes, and also his personal integrity. I mean, the man died with 1,000 Egyptian pounds in his bank account,
yes.
So he wasn't in it in order to sort of amass wealth for himself and so on, which Sadat to a very large extent was. So this whole thing of beating the left meant that what he thought of was, he thought of reviving the Islamist political currents, and in a sort of very non-legitimate way, in the sense of creating groups, funding them, rigging elections in professional syndicates and student unions so that they would gain power as a way of hitting at the left. And of course what he didn't count on was that these people, they didn't think, oh, we're pawns in his game, we'll just do what he wants. They really had their own ideas that they believed in, and they turned against him, and they turned against him in the end for many of the same reasons that the left didn't like him, which was the social injustice that came about during his time and the terrific corruption that his regime instituted, and that Egypt has not been able to recover from since.
But I take it you think that the extreme Islamic movements won't solve anything?
I don't think they'll solve anything at all, no.
I think one of the many virtues of the books have politically, quite apart from every other level they work on, they're extremely detailed politically, and you have followed this whole process through from the beginning and shown how it happened. But what I'm hearing tonight from you is something I didn't expect to hear, which is that you don't really think that the Israel problem, which is seen as the Israel problem by the Arab world, can be solved radically. In other words, they simply have to come to terms.
I think almost everybody, apart from a sort of extreme fringe, now believes that, you're not going to get, you're not going to get rid of Israel. But what you do want is for Israel to live within its borders.
Does that put you in a vulnerable position vis-à-vis extreme Islam? First of all, is extreme Islam a big enough movement to frighten intellectuals in the moderate Arab world?
Well, it's done enough nasty things, of course. I mean, there are secular intellectuals in Egypt who've been killed, or who've been attacked, or who've been forced to live in exile abroad, and so on.
Does that apply to you? You're not forced to live?
No, I'm not forced to live. I mean, I'm forced by circumstances, but by personal, but no.
I want to get that in a minute, because I think there are things you can say here that you might find it harder to say at home.
Yeah, well,
let me say it now. Is that true? Is it easier for you to speak out if you're outside the Arab world than it would be within?
no, it isn't, because anything I say anyway gets translated and published within a week. So there's no hiding place.
I was wrong about that.
Whatever I say.
I was just about as wrong as I could be about it.
No, I mean, my books and my articles are read in English across the Arab world anyway. I mean, AUC sell many, many copies of my books. I mean, the American University in Cairo bookshop, they sell lots of copies of my books. And also things, as I say, get translated and published and reported on and so on. So it's...
After the movie of A Map of Love that they're going to sell by the millions, after Russell Crowe plays the Sheikh. But what we want is, we want the Arab guy to play the Sheikh.
Well, Clive, I rely on you for this one. I have no contacts in the movie world.
It brings me through to the point now, because the Arab world could not have a better representative than you. But now I want to ask you about the other struggle, which is the struggle for women's rights within the Arab world. And that's in your books too. Let me give you two examples. I think it's in The Sandpiper, if not in Aisha. No, it's in The Sandpiper, where a girl is going to have an education and it gets ruined because her own brother is so pure and pious that he's so appalled that he finds he has a desire for her that he makes sure she stays out of school so that she won't be any more tempting to him. Now,
he gets her married off so she can leave the house.
He gets her out of the house and gets her married off so that she can no longer tempt him. And that's the end of her education. Now, this is a big theme in your books, is the girls are going to get the education. We find they get them only through very unusual circumstances if they're with very liberal families. I've got a feeling this might have been true of your family.
Yeah, I think, though, actually, I mean, maybe there's a sort of slight imbalance here. I mean, that particular story that you referred to, the water heater, I mean, the whole point of it really is that it is a very extreme situation.
Okay, but it happens again in the book is In the Eye of the Sun, where my favourite girl in The Eye of the Sun is going to go to university, and her own worthless brother sees her walking in the street with a young man who was just a friend. And the worthless brother feels he's duty-bound to tell her father. This is all the worthless brother does. This is his sole achievement in life, is to ruin his sister's life. Right? He tells the father, and the father hurls an ashtray at his daughter with every intention of killing her. They make it up afterwards, and we find out she does get to university. But what you're dramatizing there is a tremendous force of religious convention that is fundamentally resistant to her whole idea of her freedom.
It's not religious, really. I mean, the other guy, the one in the water heater, was religious, but it's a social convention. And I mean, one can't pretend that women or girls do everything they want and lead sort of completely free lives and so on. That is not the case.
Do you want them to, is a good question.
Well, do you want
Would their
them
lives
to?
be better?
Yes, exactly. That's another question entirely. But I think, I mean, one thing just to say is that, in fact, I mean, I think that any girl in Egypt now who wants to be educated and who can get to, a university or a school or whatever, will be. I mean, when girls aren't educated, it's mostly because people are so poor that everybody sort of, has to work or whatever. There isn't a sort of institutionalized suppression anymore. And when you look at things, you'll see, I mean, 50% of people working in the media, say, in Egypt, are women. There's so much women's sort of writing.
Well, it's the very development that fundamentalism is most afraid of, is it not? That's the centre of the fear, is women having a right to speak, equality, is it not? Aren't you under extreme pressure and danger from there's no point calling it the left or the right, from the extreme wing, from men? These are men for whom the man's position in society is supreme, paramount, and must not be threatened, and they'll do anything to stop it. It seems to me that we're in grave danger that the war that is going on really will become a war within Islam, as the hardline men will go to war with moderate Arab societies of every kind in order to stop what you're talking about.
I think that when you have times of great social upheaval, a lot of the battles tend to be fought through women and over women's bodies, what they can reveal and what they have to conceal, what they can do and what they, and it's a sort of manifestation of social turbulence. And again, I mean, of course, I would not stand up for extremism in any form, and I'd sort of, be strung up from a tree if Islamic extremists came into power. But again, it has to be said that their position is not absolutely that women, whatever it is, should be hidden or should be seen and not heard. They have very specific things about segregation, for example, that it is better that men and women do not work in close contact with each other. So they would have nothing at all against girls' schools or against women teaching girls or against, in fact, you'd have to have female doctors so that women don't have the necessity of exposing themselves to male doctors. So what I'm trying to say is that things are just more layered. I mean, it isn't the case that every Islamic extremist movement is like the Taliban and just wants to lock up women at home. It is different.
Well, I was certain of many things before I read your books, and the things I was certain about, I became less certain about. One thing I did become certain about is that I needed to know more, and this is the way to find out. And literature in modern times in the West has rather lost that function because journalism does it. There are so many other media. And the way you write actually restores that function to literature. So along with all the other virtues of your books, they actually do tell you about the world. And for people listening out there, I want to recommend them. Read the novels of Ahdaf Soueif.
Well, thank you.